Anxiety is a bad feeling, whether it is caused from stress at work or stress at school, or maybe because you forgot to study for a test, or maybe you don't even know why you're anxious. But anxiety is actually a good thing in some ways. Imagine you're a caveman walking through the woods and you see a predator who wants to eat you in front of you. Anxiety is what creates that fight or flight response, so that way you can defend yourself from the predator in front of you. But if you have an anxiety disorder or you're overly anxious, that alarm in your head might be going off too much, or maybe it's going off for a false reason. So what causes anxiety and how can you make your anxiety go away? Every thought you've ever experienced and every emotion you've ever felt is just thanks to electrical impulses and chemical reactions in your brain. But what causes anxiety? Well, let's break it down. The amygdala, the fear center of your brain, is located right here. Now, the word amygdala comes from the Greek word meaning almond. And although your amygdala is about the size of an almond, if not even smaller, it is still super important. The amygdala is located in the limbic system right here, which is just a bigger network in your brain. But its main responsibility is detecting fear. Every phobia you've ever had, every time you've been scared, every time you've been jump scared in a movie, and every panic attack you've ever had is thanks to the amygdala. Now, in people who have an anxiety disorder, the amygdala might just be a little more hyperactive, meaning it works a little harder than it needs to, or it should to. Now, there are ways to fix this that we will get into later in the video, but the amygdala is connected to a very important part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is this region of the brain. Now, although the prefrontal cortex has a lot of purposes, its primary function is in making decisions. Now, for instance, when you come across something that is scary, your prefrontal cortex decides, is that scary or no? If it's not scary, then the process kind of ends there. But if something is scary, the prefrontal cortex sends a message to the amygdala to let you know that you should be fearful and this is something that could be bad. And therefore, the amygdala gives you the sense of fear. But in people who have an anxiety disorder, the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is much weaker. Therefore, it can be harder to override a fear-based response. So if you see something that you know isn't necessarily scary, you might still get anxious over it anyway. Now, another very important part of the brain connected to the amygdala is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in charge of producing hormones to control your body. So this would be like heart rate, body temperature, and producing hunger. So when the amygdala says, oh, you should be scared and fearful, it sends a message to the hypothalamus, and in turn the hypothalamus emits adrenaline and cortisol. And this is why when you're anxious, your heart beats a little faster. It's because adrenaline is being produced. And your muscles kind of tighten up. It's because of the adrenaline and cortisol being produced in your body. This is why your anxiety is hard to fix, because you can't control how many hormones your hypothalamus makes, and you can't control how hyperactive your amygdala is. So how do you make your anxiety just go away? Well, your brain is always sending messages to one part of the brain to the other part of the brain. These messages are called neurotransmitters, and there are ways to write your own neurotransmitter, if you will. So, what neurotransmitters does anxiety play a role in? Well, the three big ones are GABA, serotonin, and norepinephrine. GABA is like your brain's brake pedal. When your brain is working overtime, working super hard, GABA is produced to tell your brain to slow down. Serotonin is primarily what provides emotional stability, and this is why people who have frequent panic attacks often get prescribed antidepressants, is because that medication increases your level of serotonin, and therefore you can have more emotional stability and less panic attacks. And then norepinephrine is just the chemical that produces stress. So in people who have anxiety, all three of these chemicals are typically out of balance. GABA is typically too low, serotonin is too low, and norepinephrine is too high. So how can you write your own neurotransmitter to tell your brain to just calm down? Anxiety is scary, And it's even one of the most common mental disorders now too. More than 1 in 5 people have been found to have it. But I would like to offer you an approach to hopefully help you with your anxiety, if that's something you have a problem with. Now, firstly, don't treat anxiety as a monster that needs to be defeated. Remember, anxiety is your brain's fire alarm, and without anxiety, humans would probably have died out a long time ago. Because anxiety is good. It's what gives you that sense of danger so then you can protect yourself. But if you ever find yourself being overly anxious, maybe try the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 rule. If you're ever somewhere, name 5 things you see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you smell, and even 1 thing you taste. This exercise just forces you to live in the present. Instead of being anxious about what already happened 20 minutes ago, and instead of being scared about what could happen, it just relaxes you and forces you to live in the present. And after that, maybe just relax your muscles, take a deep breath, and calm down. And even splash some cold water on yourself, as that activates the nervous system and reduces panic by a lot. Everyone has triggers for their anxiety, and I encourage you to take out a piece of paper or a journal and write down what triggers your anxiety. Now, the trick to really getting rid of your anxiety and curing it is to do whatever triggers it more and more. For instance, if driving makes you anxious, maybe just go for a short drive around the block, around your neighborhood, and just do that more and more each day. Even if it's talking to people, going out into a loud social setting, or maybe even being alone. Do whatever triggers your anxiety more and more. And if you do that, your brain will start to realize there's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to be anxious about, and what I'm doing is okay. So if you do whatever triggers your anxiety, it'll slowly start to go away. I promise, I know from experience. Write what triggers your anxiety and do it more and more. Maybe set goals for yourself. On top of that, meditation can be huge for somebody who suffers from chronic anxiety. Meditation activates your parasympathetic nervous system, and that in turn reduces stress and norepinephrine by a ton. On top of that, studies have even shown people who meditate on a daily basis for about 10 minutes a day actually have a smaller amygdala and therefore experience less fear in their life. As well as physical exercise works, not just mental exercise. Physical exercise burns off a ton of adrenaline, and adrenaline is a main neurotransmitter that is responsible for anxiety. So if you ever experience frequent panic attacks or you're just anxious a lot, go outside and burn off some adrenaline. Or maybe stay inside and go to the gym. But either way, get some physical exercise. Anxiety is a big, vicious cycle. Essentially, you encounter something that triggers your anxiety, then you feel a mental disturbance, then you start to feel physical symptoms, and then after that, you avoid whatever triggers your anxiety, and then the next time you encounter that trigger, your anxiety is a lot worse. So this is why the true cure for getting rid of your anxiety is just exposing yourself to whatever makes you anxious little by little. If you want, which I highly recommend, keep a journal, write your triggers, and write goals for yourself and how you plan to overcome those triggers. Remember, anxiety is not something that needs to be defeated. It's not a big monster in your brain. It's a friend that is required for survival. So don't look at it as an enemy, just look at it as a friend. And on top of that, if you ever find yourself getting anxious somewhere or having a panic attack, just remember, take a deep breath, live in the present, and even practice 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, if anxiety persists, CBT therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy are always an option. And on top of that, medication is always an option. Now, if you do choose CBT therapy, a lot of what you do is identify what your triggers are of anxiety and exposing yourself to them little by little. And on top of this, doing some meditation and breathing exercises. Don't forget meditation and physical exercise. Those are huge. I recommend those for anybody who's not even anxious because they're very mentally healthy, and I guarantee you will be a mentally better person if you just meditate a little more. The science behind it is pretty incredible. On top of that, That's really all I have today. Just remember, expose yourself to whatever makes you anxious, and eventually you will overcome your anxiety. I appreciate all of you for watching, and I hope my advice was helpful.